Hey, Dailies, I'm so glad you could join for a special edition of the Driven Daily Show, a show that promises to keep you driven on a daily. Now, my name is Randall, and today I have a guest that I think we're going to connect with deeply. We're going to have some crucial conversations that I know you'd enjoy if you enjoyed past interviews. Now, my guest, she's a social justice advocate, author, international speaker on Black history, anti-racism, and women issues. And she was also the driving force in securing February as the Black History Month in Canada. Dailies, let's put our hands together and let's give a warm welcome to Rosemary Sadlier. Welcome, Rosemary.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that very kind introduction.
You know what? It's all you. You did it. I didn't. It's all you, Rosemary.
Well, I have done a couple of things, but thank you anyway.
No, indeed. And we're definitely going to go into, your journey and how things evolved for you. However, I'm going to start off this episode with being a bit selfish, Rosemary. Can I be a bit selfish?
Well, we'll see. Where's that going?
So Prime Minister Brian Mulroney during the 1980s broke ranks with other Western nations to impose sanctions on SA, South Africa, if apartheid was not dismantled, a move that later influenced other nations to do the same. Canada lifted those sanctions in 1993, and the following year, Nelson Mandela was elected as the President of South Africa. Mandela was the first person abroad from prison, or rather, his first visit abroad from prison was to Canada. And he was the first living person to be given the honorary Canadian citizenship in 2001. Now, Rosemary, I said all of this to say and to ask, what was that time like? Do you remember that moment, and how did that influence you, if any?
Yeah, we're talking in a way ancient history, even though I'm 29. And the reality is that it was I think an incredibly important milestone in the history of civil rights globally. Nelson Mandela had been, for his lifetime, essentially his lifetime, his adult lifetime, imprisoned and always held up as an example of significant oppression. And I think just a little backstory, the setting up of the apartheid system to begin with, when I learned that it was actually modeled on the Canadian system of creating reservations for First Nations, it always left me feeling very uncomfortable, to say the least.
Yeah.
So at that point in time, I was very, very pleased, very moved, very excited. And I think, generally people of conscience all were. I remember when Nelson Mandela came to Toronto and he had a visit to, I think it was called Maple Leaf Gardens at the time. And it was massive. And it was, I guess, many school children from Toronto District School Board. And I was there, and I was about a meter away from him. I kept pushing my way to get close, and I just couldn't get that close. And it was before cell phones. So, I have no record of it, but it happened. And to just be after he addressed like thousands of people at that event, and everybody was quiet and respectful and so appreciative of this person who had undergone so much, standing for principles and standing for important values. That was, I think, just that combination of factors, and just, dare I use the idea that he had great energy. Like in his presence, there was a calm and a peacefulness, and it was really quite amazing. So, I mean, I'm speaking about it more from a subjective level, just because I believe at the time my public involvement in anything connected to social justice was very limited.
I hear you. And thanks for sharing just a brief on what that experience was like. If I could turn back the hands of time, I would have loved to be in in a public setting where I can just hear him speak, and not necessarily just hear, but I would love to feel what it felt like.
Amandla.
Can you say that again, just for the records?
Amandla.
Wonderful. So, Rosemary, I know our time is limited, and I really want to maximize the time that I have with you. Thanks again for giving us the pleasure of having you on, Rosemary. I do appreciate your presence, eh?
Thank you.
Now, I do know that you were the former president of the Black. Could you now? I just want to make sure that I'm getting this correct. You were born in Canada. Your family was born in Canada. And I'd love to jump into this story because I think this would be really really eye-opening for our viewers. You shared a story on a previous interview where you went to a school in the east of, I think it was east of Scarborough. Let me just get this right here. There we go. On the East End in Toronto. And you asked the students a question that seemed easy, but turned out not to be so easy. You asked the question, what does a Canadian look like? And everyone, or rather you first asked, where are you from? And they all guessed an answer that, that wasn't true. And then you asked them, what does a Canadian look like? And they all pointed to a student in the class that had blonde hair. I think it was blue or green eyes. And he was from Poland. My question to you, Rosemary, it then begs the question, what does a Canadian look like?
Well, a Canadian, depending on how you want to answer that question, a Canadian looks like us all. But, on the lands that we now call Canada, I think that the earliest Canadians would look like the First Nations. But what a lot of people don't always factor into what is a Canadian is the reality that people of African origin were on these lands we now call Canada early as well. They were here in the 1400s and the 1500s, and the first named, not the first one we have a name for, African to arrive on the lands we now call Canada was Matthew da Costa in 1604. Yeah. So when you consider that Black people have been on the lands we now call Canada since 1604, and we know First Nations were here, we know that white people or Europeans are here, how is it then that we can only decide or determine that a Canadian would have one look? And why was the look that was selected somebody who was so particularly Nordic? But that's what the narrative tells us. In other parts of the world, and even within this country, to say that I'm Canadian makes people question, makes people wonder. And they'll ask me, like I didn't hear the question properly. Or they'll think that I'm just talking about having just arrived, and they probe, hoping for me to provide them with my actual birthplace or my actual heritage in another country. But the reality is that there are Black people like me who have been in this country, whose ancestors have been in this country for a very long time. In my case, I happen to represent all of the first major waves of migration to Canada of Black people.
Really?
I'm on my mom's side, Underground Railroad. I'm a descendant of a survivor of the Underground Railroad experience in Ontario. And on my father's side, they were invited to come to Canada as Black loyalists, arriving in New Brunswick. They were the late loyalists, and they were the refugees of the War of 1812. So I never really thought that much about being a Canadian until people othered me. And then I had to think about what that meant to be a Canadian, and what does a Canadian look like in the imagination of most people who reside on these lands.
No, indeed. It reminds me of when I came to Canada, Rosemary. Before I came to Canada, of course, we all have our stereotypes in our minds of what Canadians or what other people would look like from different countries. And to be frank with you, when I was thinking about, okay, I'm coming to Canada now, and what am I going to expect? I honestly thought it was going to be a certain demographic only. And when I came to Canada, and I realized that because everyone was from everywhere, a part of me felt relaxed knowing that I'm not the only one over here. And I'm sure many immigrants feel that way too. And I just wanted to share that with you. I know you mentioned previously when I asked the question regarding, Nelson Mandela, you mentioned that apartheid, and I have to ask this question. You mentioned that apartheid was modeled on a system that was originated here in Canada. Do you mind expounding on that, Rosemary?
Just, briefly, what happened early in the 19th century, 20th century, representatives from South Africa came to examine and monitor how the reservation system here was working, because there was clearly an interest in finding a way to keep populations separate.
Okay.
And they had the opportunity to be introduced to what we don't talk about it that much, but we have a reservation system. There are very separate and distinct areas in Canada where First Nations people reside, and they're generally outside of major cities. So I realized that, even growing up, I had never been to a First Nations community because they're somewhat out of the way. And which adds to their lack of visibility for us in a contemporary way, and a lack of our being able to, until more recent times, be concerned about the inequities that were clearly evidenced by the way people lived and by the deprivation of services that some of them received. So they did come, they did examine, they did study, and with that information went back and established apartheid, pulling much of it from what they witnessed in a fellow Commonwealth country.
Wow. This is new to me. I didn't know this, and I'm sure for some of our viewers too, it would be new. And if you have just joined us right now, thanks so much for giving us your heartbeat, spending your time with myself and Rosemary. Now, just looking at your biography, there's so much that you do, specifically when it comes to being an advocate, and everything that you do seems to point back to being an advocate. Where did this start? When I think of someone being born, I don't think someone comes out of the womb saying, I want to become an advocate. I'm just kidding. How did that start, Rosemary? You becoming such a pivotal voice when it comes to Black history?
Sometimes you become involved in things because it just works and it's a natural progression of things. And sometimes you become involved in things in opposition to things around you. And I would say that for me, it was a dynamic blend of both. My entire experience told me I wasn't here, told me I wasn't important. There was no representation at any level of Black people when I was a young child, or even when I was a teenager, really. The only time that a Black person might be featured on the news is if there had been a horrendous crime committed. And so it was a total lack of representation. I had the good fortune to be involved in a church that my mother took me to, Underground Railroad descendant. She took me to a church that had been established by other Underground Railroad descendants. And it was a Black church. And through my own experience, despite what I was learning in school, despite what I was not seeing in school, despite what the overarching narrative was suggesting, I was seeing Black people doing things in all kinds of positions, people who were articulate, people who could sing, people who were decent human beings in all shades. And not only did I see them in Toronto, I saw them across the province because I had the opportunity to go to church conferences, which were sometimes fun and sometimes not so fun. But what it introduced me to was the reality that there were purposeful, intelligent, kind communities of Black people across the country, the province for sure. And of course, I could then assume across the country. So when I ended up, long story, but when I ended up finishing university and getting married and having kids, and I think there was a part of me that was shocked to be reminded or to be reawakened to the reality that racism continues in this country. And I became involved with an organization that I thought was going to be helpful in addressing some of that. So I became a volunteer presenter. I was then put on the board of directors. I had been doing presentations in schools, hundreds. And by the time I became the president, which was completely unplanned and unexpected, I had built up a significant community of interest of people who were interested in Black history. And because of an administrative glitch, I started a process of formalizing the commemoration of February's Black History Month. Already been done by the Ontario Black History Society founders, but what I didn't know when I became the president is that we had to ask the City of Toronto every year, please, can we have Black History Month? And it almost was lost to us. So I thought, no, not ever again. And it started me on the process of getting it more firmly established municipally, but jumping up to the provincial level, and then also trying to have it established nationally. And I approached many people, but ultimately it did land with Jean Augustine, who got it through the House. But I initiated the process to make it happen. And it happened actually relatively quickly, all things considered, because I think that there was an appetite that I and the OBHS had already created. But around the same time, I also began working on having August 1st formalized as a commemoration, August 1st being the end of slavery in this country. And I started that process around the same time, but it didn't happen until March 2021, almost 25 years later. And there were many kicks at the can, many. It went through on a unanimous bill with the province of Ontario. It went through quickly with the city, with Metro, with the city of Ottawa. But the federal situation, it went to second reading twice in the House. It went to second reading twice in the Senate. And then it wasn't until March 2021 that it went through.
Man, oh man, what a journey. Rosemary, I can just imagine how you must have felt. And I'd like you to take us just briefly to that moment when you realized, I'm not sure if it was on a specific, I don't know how this moment came about, when you officially heard that Black History Month was approved.
I found out in December 1995. This is before social media. I had been in constant contact with the office of Jean Augustine. I had been providing her office with Black history information on an ongoing basis. We still had faxes, and that's how I was sending her information, sending her office information. And in December, I was encouraged to watch CPAC when I would have the opportunity to see her doing the final reading. And I was the only person who was not an elected official who was invited to address the nation at the very first celebration of February, Black History Month in February 1996. That was kind of exciting. Yeah.
Kinda, not kinda, that was indeed.
It was. And I presented the Prime Minister of Canada, Jean Chrétien, with an art print that had been created by David Kubuka, and which later copies of it were used as our official Black History Month poster. I believe I presented Jean Augustine with flowers. It was just a very nerve-wracking but exciting and wonderful day.
Yeah, mixed emotions like a roller coaster, eh?
Well,
Now,
yeah, because, it's finally happening, and I guess the other part of it is the expectation. It had never happened before, so what can happen now? And I really fully expected that there would be required Black history education from K to 12 at that moment in time, even before that moment in time, but for sure at that moment. Not because education is a federal responsibility, but because with it already having been passed with the province of Ontario, and with this additional federal weight of having a national declaration. And I also had been able to get Black History Month through all the other provinces.
yeah.
I felt that now there would be a rationale to, if there wasn't one before, then now there would be a rationale to have this required education. It has not happened yet. And so, there's the upside that we have the commemoration, which didn't cost anybody too much money. We don't have the action. We don't have the what makes it much more meaningful, and what I think really addresses the seminal aspects of anti-Black racism.
I totally hear you. And, for those that are, just tuned in right now, we want to thank you for spending your time with myself and Rosemary. We've got about just roughly 20 minutes left on the show. I know Rosemary still needs to get her suntan on in the middle of winter. Likewise, myself, we're going to head outside just to get some fresh air. However, in connection with Black History Month, as you mentioned before, Matthew da Costa, he arrived in 1604. And he was the first freed African to arrive. And then thereafter, the first enslaved African also arrived here in Canada. It really begs the question whether or not Canada was or was not founded on slavery.
It was, and I'll tell you why it was. There were enslaved Africans on these lands that we now call Canada in the 1400s, in the 1500s. We know that places where there's a loose border, like Detroit and Chicago, were founded by Africans. So there were Africans on these lands who were also coureurs de bois. The first named African arrived on the lands we now call Canada in 1628. And actually in October, the culmination of my efforts to have Olivier Lejeune, the first named African, commemorated were realized with the unveiling of a plaque that's in a park in Quebec City. So that happened recently. But so 1628 is the beginning, not really, but because he's the first person we have a name for, 1628. And then we know that slavery did not end outright and for sure until August 1st, 1834. So from 1628 until 1834, there was enslavement of First Nations and Africans on the lands we now call Canada.
It then begs the question, when I think of Africa, you think of a society formed, based and founded on slavery. Why isn't this so pronouncedly announced? Is it intentionally, or is it announced? Is my ears just closed? Or, because when I listen to what you are saying, and many of us listen to what you are saying, Canada founded on slavery, that doesn't tie together.
Well, here's why it's a loose point. Canada wasn't Canada until July 1st, 1867.
Okay.
So technically, on July 1st, 1867, there was no slavery in Canada. That is true. However, July 1st, 1867, people didn't all en masse show up, and the lands were cleared, the exploration had been done, the maps were created, the cities were built, the communities had been set up, the farmlands had been plowed and planted. No, Canada was built on what had gone on before. And for 200 plus years on the lands we now call Canada, there was slavery.
Okay.
So did slavery not then have an impact and an influence on the founding of Canada? Was slavery not a central aspect of the creation of Canada? Were not the people who came into Canada from Europe also not the beneficiaries of the transatlantic slave trade? Were not the white loyalists who came into Canada not people who brought enslaved Africans in with them? There's so many ways to look at this, but essentially, I would say it was founded on slavery.
And I think that's probably one of the mandates and purposes of having the Black History Month, is to make us all aware of the different dynamics and how Canada was formed.
I think so.
Yeah. When I think of back home, I see so much similarities from back home, South Africa, and here in Canada. Now, in one of your interviews that you had, you mentioned a quote, and I'm going to paraphrase.
Okay.
You said that systemic racism is backed up by politics and religion. That's what makes it systemic. It brings me to the analogy and the example back home in South Africa, Rosemary. We have something called BEE, Black Empowerment, Black Economic Empowerment. It's essentially, for example, at a workplace, there's a certain quota that needs to be met when it comes to how many Black people needs to be employed. Now, there's the age-old debate of, do you have the quota being met versus efficiency and effectiveness? So for example, you can have an entire organization filled with a certain demographic, but because of BEE, there needs to be a certain amount of Black people that is in an organization. I'm not sure how it works here in Canada when it comes to the quota of there being Black people in an organization. The question that I have for you, Rosemary, what's your thoughts on an organization? I know this might just be something that you may not have expected, but I'd love to hear from you off the cuff. What's your thoughts on an organization? Should an organization be forced to have a certain demographic within the organization, or can it hire whoever it wants based on merit and merit only?
We've had a system of people hiring on merit and merit only.
Okay.
And it has brought about incredibly slow inclusion and diversity. That is what the system has been up until this point in time. And so I think that that's one way to answer the question. Another way to answer the question is just to remind the listeners that because somebody is Black or Indigenous or First Nations or a person of color doesn't mean that they're without merit. It just means that often what happens when there are hiring decisions or purchasing decisions or whatever the entity might be. People reach out to people who look like them, people that they play golf with, people that they went to school with, people, whatever the connection might be. And so those people generally look the same. So instead of there being diversity, and here diversity of race, diversity of ethnicity, diversity of gender expression, diversity of age, diversity of thought, there it rules that out by just by those selections. If you pick people who are just like you perpetuate what is already there, because there is no challenge to the way of thinking and the way of doing. The other part is to impose a number is a help, and certainly things like cluster hires, I think, are really good ideas. But sometimes a number, I mean, I think it can work, but I can also see how it could be problematic. If you indicate that there has to be one Black person or 5 Black person, well, what if there's 20 Black people that are really great, that should be included, or that could bring value to that particular institution? Then it can be used to deny. One more piece to this is that the interpretation of what is a diverse population, or a population that ought to be included. Black women know very often that sometimes women take up some of the places that, because they are considered diverse in many institutions. So efforts are made to increase the female population, but are those same efforts made to increase the intersectional population of, for example, black women in that same space? So there's just many factors. A number isn't exactly the answer, but it would be a help. It would be something to consider until such time as it might become problematic.
You know, I like the way you answered that. It really touched on different ways of looking at the very same situation. You know, Rosemary, when it comes to self-esteem and, you know, being oppressed for a long time, and that infiltrating into generations till today, you know, many of us, some of us, we've gotten the degrees to try to build our self-esteem, to try to make ourselves feel competent and on the same level as others. We've gotten the fancy car, the fancy home, we've got the money in the bank, but still, Rosemary, some of us feel like, I'm not good enough. For an individual that's watching right now that is feeling that way, how would you approach that conversation?
You are enough. You are enough. And one of the things about racism is also the reality of internalized racism. We are all hearing those same grand narratives. When I was a child, you know, I'm talking about being protected, and I already knew what Black people were supposed to be. And there was nothing positive. And I was Black, so it was a bit of dissonance. I think that if I had only had those messages and not had my parents to offer me counterpoints, or my lived experience to offer me counterpoints, even as a very young child, I would have had difficulty in addressing issues of identity. And I think many people are coming into this country, they may not have thought that they needed to question or challenge or support or shore up identity. And so they don't. And until they realize that they've ingested the grand narrative that does not include them. And it's problematic.
It is. It is, and if you're watching right now, we want to thank you for giving us your heartbeat. She's speaking directly to you. You are, you are enough. Now, Rosemary, we've got a few more moments left. It really begs the question, and because the show, and the nature of the show being called Driven Daily, I'd like us to just dig a little bit deeper. Was there a moment, Rosemary, where you felt not driven? Was there a moment where you felt like how am I going to make it out of it? And could you take us there? And if so, can you also share with us how you transitioned from that moment to being in a position right now where you feeling enough?
I think one of there's so much to be done. Number one, that I personally could not do it all myself. That's one. Two, Black history is not just about knowing facts and figures and events. It's also about, it's really essential Black representation. And we require representation in everything, not just in terms of a historical school curriculum, but in every facet of our society, because we are in every facet of our society. We are about history, but we are also creating history, and we also are involved in the arts and in politics and science and so many things. All that to say that when I have lost a sense of what I'm doing, I have to go back to what is my purpose. What is the thing that is important to me? And also, I think that it means for me that it's okay to have a bad day. It's okay to have a day when you just can't do it all, because you can't do it all anyway.
Yeah.
And the third for me is to stay in my lane. I can't do, I by chance, I became the president of the only provincial heritage organization in this country with a focus on Black history.
Wow.
And I was in that position for a very long time, significantly because I wasn't, for many reasons.
Yeah.
But that was the platform that I had to use, and I held it like a precious legacy to do what I could for this community, for our society. And but I think you make a difference where you are, and with the skills that you have and the time and resources that are available to you. But just do something.
So true. Just do something. It really leads me to that point. The next point, which I really wanted to ask you. And thanks for sharing that, Rosemary. It really makes me wonder, in which way can people get involved when it comes to Black history, anti-racism, women issues? Many of us cannot be a president. Many of us cannot have a high position. I feel like we should get involved. How can one get involved, whether it's not on a big scale, but a small scale?
Find out what's going on where you are. Recognize and address things that are problematic where you are. Find people that are like-minded, perhaps, and see what you can do together. If not, if there's something that you feel is wrong or egregious or just needs to change, you are the agent of change. You are the change that you are looking for. And keep that in mind as you move forward.
Absolutely. Now, speaking about moving forward and keeping that in mind, for the viewers that are listening right now, and I think this is a perfect segue, and this is going to be the final question that I have for you. Many folks from Toronto are watching right now, from Canada, and also from Cape Town, South Africa, and certain areas in South Africa as well. You and I both know, Rosemary, that times can be very challenging. You and I know the prices of rent, groceries, and all the basic necessities are rising. For those that are watching and that is feeling like 2024 is so overwhelming, it feels like 2023 all over again. Specifically for those that are watching from Toronto and from Cape Town right now, any words that you'd share for those individual spirits that's just feeling overwhelmed right now, especially, us as people of color right now watching?
I think the reminder that the situation that we find ourselves in isn't a situation of your making, and to always have hope, because we have children, we have things that we are in our control. The old adage, you can't change the things that are not. What is it? How does it go? Changing the things that you can change.
Yeah, the serenity prayer. Yeah, changing the things that you can, and
to not be overwhelmed. Find that piece of the issue that you can deal with, and deal with it.
So true. So true. We've heard it right here from Rosemary Sadlier. Thanks so much for joining, and thanks so much for sharing with us and giving us insight on the history of Canada, specifically in the Black context. Before we go, how are you feeling, Rosemary? How are you feeling?
Well, I'm feeling great.
You feeling good?
Black History Month is over, so I'm on to continuing. I have a book coming out. The kids.
Come on, you've got to share it with us. Yeah.
Well, the kids' book of Black history in Canada. It's an updated version of a bestseller that I wrote a number of years ago, and with all new artwork. So I think it's, some people think, oh, kids' books, but remember, there's no required Black history education for kids, so they need to get reasonable information somewhere. And not only do kids need it, but it's a great quick read for adults too.
Absolutely. Congrats on the new book coming out. When is it coming out?
It's available pre-order right now on Amazon.ca.
Okay, wonderful. And the name of the book one more time?
The Kids' Book of Black History. Oh, I have a flyer here. The Kids' Book of Black History in Canada.
Wonderful. We'll make sure to put the Amazon link in the description when this will be released. There it is. There it is. Big and bold. Thanks so much, Rosemary. For those that are watching, we want to thank you for joining. And like we always say, we are not here just to survive. We are here to thrive. And until next time, thanks again, Rosemary.
Thank you.
Thank you.